Yeah, you started early in your comments about saying how absurd our policy toward Cuba was. And I wonder if thinking of it as absurd actually is not helpful, because from my point of view, our policy toward Cuba basically has to do with the fact that we don't want any other possible way in the world to be recognized. Our way is the only way. And this is one of the reasons we have problems with Venezuela and Iran. Any other country that wants to go its own way winds up in our gun sights, and so in the gun sights of the United States. I don't like to say our, but my question is, if we were good as peace activists at a level which don't have power, but are trying to address the American people, what is the point that we should mostly be focusing on? Is it the idea that we do not want the United States to be a hegemon, that we want a multipolar world? Is that a, I'm concerned about from if you have any insight into what could be the critical point that we as citizens press, in relationship to a government which, hardly is our government.
That's a very serious question. And I've given this much thought in Havana, in Santiago, and other places with Cuban interlocutors and with Americans visiting with me and others. I'll start there and just say that Cuba's a special case. The real hangover for the United States is they threw our dictator, Fulgencio Batista, out. They confiscated our property, really Cuban property, and they had the colossal gall to allow the Russians to put missiles that threaten the United States directly from Cuba. And it's a special case. It's a special case which we don't even remember those things now, most of us, but we're willing to resurrect them and to pull them out in National Security Council meetings and say, see, these people should never be forgiven. Never, never, never forgiven. And I've seen that happen. Move on to the next issue. What's the next issue on the agenda? You're not going to talk about that. So Cuba's a special case, and it's a case that just teaches you about the quality of leadership, particularly since Eisenhower, that we've had in the United States. Deteriorating, I would argue, almost every term after Eisenhower in some way or another. A lot of the times because of inexperience. I mean, you can't find an Eisenhower, you can't find a George Washington every day. So experience, my students will tell you the number one requirement for a president is experience, and the number one deficit for most presidents in the post-World War II era is lack of experience. So when you come to questions like you just made, I think it's and recognize that we're a democratic federal republic, or a federal republic with democratic tendencies. It's very difficult to make policy. It's very difficult to change things. It's very difficult to say, I am going to have, as we did on the Quincy Institute conference call today, a more powerful State Department than I have a military department. Very hard to say, because $715 billion is going to the one and less than 100 to the other, because there are military officers all over the world who are bigger diplomats, more powerful diplomats than anybody at the State Department. When the combatant commander in Honolulu goes to Tokyo, he carries everything with him: fighter and bomber wings, carrier battle groups, Marine amphibious ready groups, you name it. He is given office and counsel by the head of Japan's government. When the Undersecretary of State or the Assistant Secretary of State goes, he's not even recognized. He's lucky if he can get a call. That's the reality of America today. If we don't change that, if we don't shift, as we talked about today at Quincy, if we don't shift that, we're in trouble, and we're going to finish up. we're going to finish up, and we're going to finish up in a blaze. We're not going to find an off ramp and so forth. Got a suggestion when I was Chief of Staff of the Air Force, which sounds crazy, but it addresses exactly what I'm talking about for the whole nation and the whole use of power in the world. This suggestion came from a lieutenant colonel at the Naval War College in a paper she had written, and we passed around the State Department. She proposed, and it's a lot more intricate than I'm going to say here, but this is the basic nature of it, that instead of having 4-star admirals and generals in all these places, we have undersecretaries of state. We get them out of Washington. We make them work foreign policy, not domestic policy. They live in Honolulu. They live in Stuttgart. Their deputy is the 4-star general, heretofore been the king in that region. So you have a civilian on top and a military 4-star underneath him. Were there to be a global conflict or a regional conflict in that area, the situation would reverse. The civilian would become the military officer's deputy, and the military officer would be in charge until it was over, and then the civilian would take over again. That's the kind of dramatic change you would have to make in the way we address power and its use in the world in order to get the kind of change I think I'm talking about. And that is to bring about a world that does more talking than fighting, and that talk is productive. Is that so hard to imagine? Yes, in our country, because we have become a warfare state.
Yeah, and you just answered Colonel Wilkerson the next question that I was going to ask you, which is a great one from the chat. I just want to credit James. And he asked, have we become so enamored in this country with our military power that we're no longer able to realize the value of diplomacy? I think that's a major crisis that we need to resolve.
That's an excellent question. And we didn't resolve even the way we were going to approach it at Quincy. And we're going to have to have a lot more meetings about how we're going to write about it, talk about it, and so forth. Let me give you another indicator. I belong to the Eisenhower Media Network. This is people like Eric Edstrom, if you've read his book, Danny Surgeon, if you've read any of his books.
We know him well. Eric Edstrom's a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. We know and love him.
The Brown Institute, for example, the Sarah Sewell and the group up there, the Cost of War Project, they just reduce, I sent it around to everybody I know today. They just produced a document that says how many suicides we have in the military. It's outpacing anything like what we have in the civilian world, and it's abominable in the civilian world. And one of the reasons we talked about this, military veterans talked about this, one of the reasons is because we're asking them to kill people for Lockheed Martin. They kill babies and women and children. They destroy homes. They displace families, all for God and country. Hell no, it's not for God and country, unless they're working for Mephistopheles. It's for Lockheed Martin. It's for Raytheon. It's for Boeing. It's for the 0.001% of the people in this country that own 60% of the wealth, the GDP of Brazil. It's for all of these other special interests. It isn't for flag, God, and country, or anything even remotely resembling it. That caused me to do suicide too, I think, if I'd done some of the things that these men and women tell me they've done in the name of America.